recording here just to have it for anybody who's out. And I just wanted to show you, we're in the coursework area of the Blackboard page. I just went through and kind of updated pretty much everything that we have left, so there's a little bit fresher, newer examples. But this is where we are right now. Of course, homework 9 is canceled. So we're looking at this project. Our issue today is foreshortening. So foreshortening is sort of simple to understand. It's a little bit harder to pull off because your brain is going to try to trip you up. Your brain is going to say, that can't be right. People's legs are longer than that. Their arms are longer than that. So you kind of have to trust yourself a little bit in terms of measuring, checking angles, and believe it or not, looking at negative space can really help. So there's 2 examples there. My personal favorite, honestly, is the Hulk, because it is based on a pose that a student did in class, but totally transformed into that kind of Marvel comic book style, and it has a really nicely rendered environment, background for it to be in. The one at the bottom is almost freakishly photorealistic. It's a really, really good drawing. The color is dead on. Like, if you saw the clothing he was wearing, it was exactly that color burgundy. It's perfect. You can clearly see that the pose there is a little bit exaggerated from the angle that the photograph was taken, but obviously what's happening in both cases, whether it's cartoon or art school realistic, you have the thing that's in the foreground, what's closer to you, is larger than normal. If you look at his hand in that dapping pose, it is so far different from the size of his head, right? The head looks tiny in comparison to how big the hand is. But look at the length of his arm. From his wrist to the white band on his shoulder is a really short distance. That's the whole trick of foreshortening. What's close to you, what's coming towards you, is going to look larger than normal. That's the foreground part, The length of that object gets shorter. So that's where the shortening comes in. I put in a bunch of examples in here. So we just pulled this up. There are examples of other people's projects we can take a look at. I also made a how to do it reference sheet in case you get turned around a little bit confused. And all of the photos that you guys were just looking at that we laid out here on the printing press are all in here too. So if you need it for another reference, or you need to print it out or just take another look at it, they're all digitally right here. But I want you to take a look at this set of examples first. This is usually, and if we had a normal semester where everybody was here for 3 days a week, we would actually start with drawing Uncle Sam. Not the face, just the hand, because I feel like that is one of the most iconic, famous images that really relies on foreshortening. Yeah, exactly. It's like he's aiming almost a gun at you. He's pointing his index finger directly out of the picture toward us. And when you see it, nobody loses their mind and thinks, whoa, what happened? Like, did they cut his finger off? Like, where's the length of it, right? That never seems to occur to anybody. And I put that photograph from a cheesy website. It was like a college scholarship, you can succeed at school kind of meme. But you see in his hand that the photograph doesn't lie, right? That is exactly what's going on with his situation too. The length of that index finger seems diminished. But I just want to really quickly show you what often happens if I ask people to draw this by hand. It's kind of funny, but we often get this thing that just does not look real at all. I'm going to switch over to my camera for a second. Okay. Now the right way around. So you've got that image of Uncle Sam pointing at you in your head. This is what I get almost every year if I ask people to draw that. You might get a thumb, index finger, and then somehow the other 3 fingers kind of like this. Little knuckle bumps. Obviously, that doesn't really look like what you just saw. But why do you suppose that happens? What is going on here, do you think, that's making people do this in their drawings? Yeah, it's like your brain is telling you that that is one of the longest digits in your entire hand, right? That index finger we use to point all the time. So drawing it like this feels really weird, right? But if you don't think of it as a body part, if you don't think of it with your kind of literal mind, try to think of it if it were something geometric. Doesn't that cylinder look like it's kind of pointing downward in space? But this one looks like it's coming out of the paper toward me. And so that's the easiest way to show you what's happening here. Yeah, this seems harder when it's something organic like a body part, an arm, a leg, whatever. But if you make it like a piece of simple geometry, it's much easier to handle. So I suggested this kind of thing even when we were talking about the trees, right? Making kind of a geometric shape around a clump of leaves and then adding highlight and shadow. So bizarrely, gang, this takes us all the way back to Project 1. That's basically a gesture. I'm showing the basic movement. Then we start thinking about the size, the measurement, the placement, the angle checking, the contour. But really, what it boils down to is looking at the gestural direction of that line first. Another thing that will really dramatically help is thinking about the negative space around the outside of the object. That will definitely help you make sure that you're not making things, ironically, too long or too short. So let's switch back over to the screen. Really different, isn't it, from what I just drew? So when you think about how that looks, this diagram really is quite helpful. You could create the illusion of pointing, in this case a finger, but that could be a thigh, it could be an entire arm from shoulder to wrist, in whatever direction you want to, if you think about the way that that would look in space, applying basic perspective concepts to geometric forms. So here's another example. This is one of a drawing that a student did in class. This is like kind of halfway before they finished their drawing of their superhero. They had a student pose for them, kind of throwing a punch. And they drew, you can see, kind of a geometric shape, almost like a rectangular solid shape, from his shoulder to the front of the fist. And it really helped him to place it in space. But you can see the one on the right does not look at all like it's coming towards you. So that's what you really want to watch out for, is that what I call the pointing down effect, where your brain is hanging on to the length of the object so hard that it refuses to listen to what your eyes are telling you. Your eyes are always going to be the best art teacher you ever have in your life. Your eyes are honest. You just have to learn to listen to them and to believe them, to not override what your eyes are telling you with what your brain knows in terms of words. Check these out. These are drawings of a human figure from a life drawing class, and the one on the left is really messed up. She doesn't look like we're looking from her feet across the body. Imagine this pose like she's lying down on her side, and we're kind of positioned at the foot of a bed, looking across the body toward her head. The drawing on the left really creates that downward pointing lengthening of the body, but the drawing on the right, you almost don't see her torso at all. You see very little of her arm from wrist to elbow because of the shortening effect that's happening with foreshortening. Now obviously, if she stood up and her arm was that tiny, like a T-Rex, and her legs were gigantic, it would look really weird. But remember that what your eye sees is not necessarily recording the actual physical dimensions of that object. We're recording what we see. Just like when we did buildings in perspective, we knew that the height of the building on the back side was the same as it was on the front, but it looked shorter because it was further away. So you are basically dealing with spatial illusions. These are the ones that I was kind of introduced to as a kid. I had those books like How to Draw Superheroes, right? I was really into comic books at one point as a kid, and I always thought that they looked believable, like they were moving in three-dimensional space. The illustration there of Superman is slightly exaggerated, but if you really go in there and were to measure the size of that fist from here to here, it's almost the same length as his leg from hip to knee. So you know that logically that can't be true, but in the position that he is in, that's what visually would seem to happen. Take a look at the difference in the two legs. This thigh from hip to knee is basically parallel to us. The knee is kind of pointing down to the ground. That leg is straight extended out behind him. So look at the short length here from hip to knee is tiny compared to this one. That fist, you could fit like 3 of those guys in here. This one is huge compared to his head. This one's tiny in comparison to the head. You can see the same thing happening here. That arm is pretty much parallel to us from elbow to wrist, so we have a kind of normal length there. Look how short that corresponding bit is. That's the elbow. That's the wrist. It's this tiny, tiny distance. So for a while, I even thought maybe this is just something that comic book artists do to exaggerate it. That's not necessarily what we really see. But check out this from a movie, which is arguably had some special effects applied to it to create this idea that he's in the sky. But you can't fake this. That length of his leg, in comparison to the lengths of the arms, is really, really short because he is somewhat foreshortened in that position. So you're used to seeing it when a camera captures it, right? Just like when you see somebody at the end of a hallway in a classroom building and they look really tiny, your brain doesn't freak out and you don't suddenly think they turned into a Smurf or something, right? You know that it's a spatial illusion. But when we go to draw it, sometimes it throws us off. So I just wanted you to be aware of how this effect is seen in reality. Both of these figures are pointing either toward us or away from us, and the length of their arms is getting much, much shorter. Same thing with old people, young people. It really doesn't matter. The body type isn't an issue. The gender's not an issue. The age, the amount of muscles, none of that. It's about the position of these elements in three-dimensional space. She has no torso at all in that pose. Look at the difference in the size of her forearms from elbow to wrist. If you compare left to right, the one on the right looks really scrawny, tiny, short, because it's receding away from us in an almost straight line away from us back toward her back leg. This one, again, shows you that almost exaggerated thing like we saw with the illustration of Superman. That hand looks enormous. That has everything to do with the angle, but look at the short length of her arm from wrist to elbow on that hand, or on that side that has the giant hand. So there's a couple over there, I think a couple of you saw these that look like people falling. These are great poses to use to turn it into something that's more animated, that's more dynamic. You could make this into a fantasy sci-fi character falling into a lava pit, or there's a ton of different things you could do with these. You could also choose to make it absolutely art school realistic, but there are some poses that are a little more toward this end of things that look a little more like dynamic superhero style poses. Some of them are a bit exaggerated because of the extreme angle, but they'll work really well for this kind of purpose. When you look at, the next time you see poster art or manga or graphic novels or anything in that vein, the ones that are really, really good nail this illusion of three-dimensional space. All of us spent like $50 a piece on the Spider-Verse movie, right? We can't help it. It works because it's believable in three-dimensional space. Even when they mix the styles of the different types of cartoons in there, it still reads believably in 3 dimensions. You see this effect all the time. That barrel of the gun, for one thing, the length of his thigh on that raised knee leg is another. But there's a lot of examples that you can think of in pop culture where you see this effect happening. We rely on it for drama and for action and for believability. Okay, so that kind of gives you an overview. This is sort of where I would start. Take a look at your pose and try to break it down in terms of some simple geometric shapes. But where are we going with it? Well, here are some examples by former students that might be interesting to you. It doesn't have to be superhero-ish, although a lot of them lean that way. It could be cutie patootie Disney. I think that one's adorable, personally. I love that one. It really is, it's kind of true to the original person who posed for it, but also to the character design. And it changes her body dramatically, of course, to create the mermaid tail. This one was a guy just sitting on the table with one leg kicked out toward us just so we could see the sole of his shoe. But now he looks like he's doing some kind of dramatic dance in Valhalla or something. This one is hilarious to me. There's a couple shots in there of a girl who's either swimming or flying that really compresses the length of her body, the torso to tush. You could go for a more kind of Sailor Moonish type style if you want to. You could go for a more comic book style if you want to. The other side of the coin, though, is that you could keep it more realistic, make it look like what you really see. This is one from last semester that was done digitally. Charcoal, another charcoal one. Graphite pencil. So if you want to keep it very true to, art school expectations, you can do that. Or you can transform those poses into something a little more imaginative. But have fun with it. Everything is available in terms of materials. You can use as much color, highlight, and shadow as you want to. You can put the characters in a variety of different settings. Really your call what you want to do with those. All right, so just switching gears for a second, let's go back to our course schedule. So here's where we are now. The foreshortening, we're starting today. Today's the 18th. The other group started on the 16th. That comes due on December 2nd. So we have next week essentially off because of Thanksgiving, but that does give you a little time to work on this to kind of pad it out some. So it's Wednesday, not this coming week, but the week after, December 2. We then, in class, on the 30th and on the 2nd, that's the same week, we'll start work on our work with pen and ink and ink wash. So for that project, we're going to be transforming a portrait. Doesn't have to be facing straight ahead, could be turned slightly to the side, but we want something that has a human face, neck, shoulders in black and white. And I have a bunch of examples that you can use, or you can bring your own. It could be a selfie, it could be a photo of a friend or a loved one, it's completely up to you. It could be a celebrity that you just want to make fun of. What we're going to do is transform these photographs by putting a grid of squares on the original photo, and then we're going to make a grid of rectangles on the drawing paper. And that will either stretch the image out left to right, so it makes it look shorter than normal and wider, or we'll turn it the other way and make it really narrow, but have the figure stretched out really tall. There are a couple other distortions that are really fun to do, including one that makes the figure look like an accordion. It kind of zigzags. The angles change on each row, and so it almost looks like the face has been folded. So just to give you an idea of what that will look like, and that is not due until the 11th of December.
That's crazy.
I know, we're that close. We're really that close. And then this week, you don't physically have to come in, but during this week is the only thing we have to do is the final exam. If I can get the final exam loaded earlier than that, Monday the 14th, I absolutely will. My goal truly is to try to get it finished before Thanksgiving. If I can launch it ahead of time, I absolutely will, so you have as much time as possible. But it's going to be the same deal as last time. You'll get like a 3-hour window to do it. You'll get 2 attempts, so it'll record the higher score. And as soon as it's available, I'll email you and let you know. But I just want you to have an idea of where we're headed for the very last project. Let's take a look at the distortions. They're pretty fun. So normally this would be 2 projects. I usually have everybody do one version that is just using the pen and one version that's only using ink wash with a brush. We're going to combine them together. We're going to use ink wash and pen and ink both and just do one drawing. But it should look kind of like this. The very first one is an accordion fold distortion. It's such a cool, fun thing to do. So with the pen and ink, that's your dippable calligraphy style pen that you're dipping into the liquid ink. That type of pen allows you to do hatching, cross-hatching, and stippling, which we haven't really done a lot of stippling. Stippling is simply using dots to create an illusion of value. More dots closer together equals darker. So stippling is great for things that are smoother. Things like shiny metal, smooth skin tend to look better done that way than in hatching or cross-hatching. This is a distortion that's really kind of a fun one to do. It's called anamorphosis. And an anamorphic image is one in which you've seen people do this probably in street art, like sidewalk chalk art, that looks suddenly three-dimensional from one particular point of view. The trick is to create a narrow end that expands and gets wider as it goes away from you. And so the image that I took on the right is the same drawing, but I photographed it by putting the camera on the short end of the drawing and photographing straight across, and it brings it back into perspective. So you could do an anamorphic image if you wanted. This one is similar to the accordion, but instead of straight lines, it's curves, so it makes things look kind of melted. There's another accordion. It's one of the better ones. The nose is terrifying, but awesome at the same time. This is an easier one to pull off, and it is a really good example of the stippling effect. This one makes the image shorter than normal, wider than normal. So it's sort of a funhouse mirror effect. This is the opposite. It's squished in. You can see the rectangles in the grid there, right? They're narrow end left to right, and the tall end of the rectangle is top to bottom. So it squishes the image in and stretches it upward. This is another short wide. This one is closer probably to what you guys will have. This one does have a fair amount of very dark black that's done just with the brush, but also the darker values were made with ink wash, which is very simply diluting the ink with water and painting it in with a brush. So we did most of the darkest values with the ink wash, but you can see closely the details in her eyes, nose, lips were all done with the pen and with stippling. That one is an effect that we sometimes call the bulge or the fisheye lens, where you make one area get way too big. So that's kind of a fun one as well. All right, so that's where we're headed. So we can go ahead, I guess, and get started on working on these foreshortenings.